Thanks everybody for being here. Mic check. Mic's not, oh, there we go. Okay. If you want to follow along with the slides, they're already posted on SlideShare. There's the QR code. You can scan it, grab the URL. I'll give you a moment to do that if you'd like. But again, they're on SlideShare. If you look for Mark Niebergall, it's really easy to find that talk and many others. You're in the Flysystem talk. If you're looking for Pauline or Dave, they're somewhere else, not here. So we'll jump right into it. First off, big thank you. We're on the last track, Thursday afternoon. Big thank you to the organizers, delegates, everyone here, speakers. I know put a lot of time in, sponsors. The company I worked for, Nuclear Security, they did their part and paid for me to come here from the States, and we have a lot of great sponsors. I've had fun going around the sponsor booths, talking with everybody, learning about their companies. I even got an elephant. I'm pretty excited about that. Got some good sweets and treats to eat. And PHP community as a whole, big thank you, an amazing group. My experience has been attending a conference. I love to learn, network, get to know some new people, catch up with people I know from the past, have some fun visiting, playing games, whatever, and take what you've learned and apply it. Start using it. Find practical ways to implement things that you've learned or been exposed to, and improve your organization, improve your projects. Take those skills and techniques and use them when you leave here. And again, congratulations, you made it to Thursday afternoon. The food has been amazing. I may have had like 3 of those cream caramels. They were so good. So again, thank you everybody. Quick poll, who is using Flysystem? We're just gonna do a quick blind poll. Got about a third, maybe half, so okay. Just want to kind of gauge audience where we're at. Has anyone ever been snowmobiling? No? I don't see any hands. Okay. I live in the western United States, in the Rockies. This is a parking lot about 20 minutes from my house. Went up with my brother-in-law. I bought these older snowmobiles to go along with a family collection of snowmobiles. This was the maiden voyage. We got up on a trail, and there's a tree across, and my brother-in-law rides across first, and his snowmobile rolls downhill into the deep powder. It did not go well. Let's just put it that way. Snowmobiles weigh about 500 pounds. I don't know the conversion for stones. It's about 3 times my weight per snowmobile, per sled. And they are heavy. You can't just like pick them up and move them. I ended up having to abandon the snowmobile overnight on Mount Timpanogos in Utah, American Fork Canyon, and had to come back for it the next day because I left my hand winch in my car. I had brought the gear with me, but left it in the back of the car, and it was impossible to pull this thing out of there, and so it actually had a burned belt and some other things going on. It made it kind of complicated the problem. So we ended up having to bring this hand winch and extra tow straps and crank this thing up the hill out onto the main trail again, because at that time the snow was kind of soft. Anyways, it was a fiasco. Long story short, the snowmobile made a home eventually. It was spent only one night on the mountains. I was very happy to have it back. Sometimes adventures don't go the way we had planned, especially if we don't have the right tools, and other problems come up. So one does not simply lift a snowmobile. I've been watching Lord of the Rings again. It was amazing. I loved it. So I had to throw that one in there. How do you effectively manage files with code is kind of a question that comes up. It's a very common problem in software engineering, very common issue to have to address, and I've seen many solutions. Some work great, some don't always work. Some I scratch my head at, I'm not sure how they work, but hey, it works. It's PHP, sometimes it does that. It's kind of a question to think about. How do you manage files? How does your project work currently? Often there's some common solutions we see, such as fopen, right? You open it up the file, you get back a resource, you do some things with it, and write files or whatever. Maybe you're using like file get contents, if you just want to grab what's inside that file and read it and do what you need to do with it. Maybe you're using that in conjunction with file put contents to push the contents back out. And then you're deleting the file off the file system because you don't need it anymore, so you're just using delete. Or maybe you need to use chmod to change some permissions or whatever. Pretty common, pretty kind of standard quo there of what to do with files. But if you've ever written files, you'll know one does not simply write files to storage. There's always problems. Every time I've tried to write files to storage, it blows up. PHP gets errors, gets resource errors, which are not super helpful. And you have to end up debugging it and trying to figure out what's going on. Files come in all sorts of file formats and sizes and permissions, and there's always something new that comes up. You get past one hurdle and there's yet another one you have to go past after that. And so one does not simply write files to storage. It's always more complex. It takes more time. There's always struggles and issues that pop up. Just like me showing up, going snowmobiling and not having the right tools with me, writing files to storage is hard without the right tools in place. Not having the right tools with you and knowing how to use them and being able to use those tools effectively to resolve your issues or resolve the problems that come up. So here's the common problem we have, right? Let's say you have a file. You need to write it out somewhere. And in your code, you think maybe I'll have a local file service, an in-memory service. Let's say you're writing out to Amazon, AWS. You've got something going out to, someone's using SFTP still. They have an older customer maybe that is a little behind the times. Other formats, whatever. And then you have each of those individual services. I call them services. Some people call them other things. And they then go do that one thing. They do it well, right? They go right out to the associated file storage location. So your local service is going to write out to your local server file system. You have something that's writing out into memory. You have something writing out to AWS. And so that's the path we have. We have a whole bunch of classes associated with that. We have a bunch of code paths going on, and it gets complicated. There's problems. You have to write tests for all these. That's where Flysystem comes in. So their quote from their webpage, Flysystem is a file storage library for PHP. It provides one interface to interact with many different types of file systems. When you use Flysystem, you're not only protected from vendor lock-in, you'll also have a consistent experience for which every storage is right for you, whichever storage is right for you. Okay? So in a nutshell, this is what it's saying it provides. We no longer have code written out individually for the different storage locations. We now have the file that's going into Flysystem, and it's then writing out to wherever it needs to, using various contracts, interfaces, and supporting packages. From a developer standpoint, we only have to worry about configuration into Flysystem, and the Flysystem knows how to write to the different places we needed to get this file. That makes my life so much easier. I don't have to worry about figuring out how to write. The most common one, I'll use AWS because I use that one the most. It's super complex. If you ever try to write into AWS raw, we'll say, if you're trying to write Guzzle using Guzzle directly, there's so many different layers, there's different permissions, you have roles going on. It's so much easier just to configure it, pointing up in Flysystem and let it take care of what it needs to do. and the file can be happy and go on its way. The objective here, walking out, I want you to be familiar with Flysystem and know how to use their API, their code. Have some ideas or concepts of how you might be able to implement this. And if you already have it implemented, hopefully I'll go over some new API, more edge cases or strategies that will be helpful in improving how you use it. So we'll go. That's kind of the strategies part of the last. The overview, we got adapters. I'll explain what the adapters are and what all they do. Exactly what the documentation, and also some, we'll call them hidden functions, if you step into their code and start looking at it. And then implementation strategies and testing at the end. It's kind of a classic, right? I won't get that working, but this little thing, if you remember this from like the 90s, downloading the internet, goes to A drive, and then it's like, you don't have next file storage space for it, right? And sorry, I can't get that working, but oh, there, it just went. Look at that. We'll let that go. That's an epic one. 42 or 41 kilobits per second, super fast. Sometimes faster than hotel Wi-Fi. Okay. So the adapters, they have, traditionally, if you think back to the diagrams I had, you have different code depending on where you're writing the file to that gets used. So you have your local service and your AWS service, whatever. And then you have, say, different code for each adapter, right? You might have different branches of code. Think about a use case. You have local for development. So as a developer, you're writing code and you want to be able to test this and run things. And so you're only using your local development machine, or maybe you're using a container or whatever you're doing. But then when the QA team comes in, maybe they want to use SFTP. And then in production, you're using S3 storage. So each environment or each server is writing off to a different place. And maybe there's a whole bunch of different types of files. So you have some JSON files, maybe you have some text files, image files, a variety of those that going around, being thrown around. Excel files, whatever. In my line of work, we have very large files that we're using, and there's a few different types, and so it gets kind of tricky. And so maybe you end up with something like this, of how you write files if you're not using S3 or any sort of adapter, or not using Flysystem. You have like a read local, if you have it all in one class, let's say, and it's returning file get contents. May or may not have some error handling on it. You have read S3, and it's returning it's going and pulling a file, and then maybe you're using a match on the storage service and going and returning based on that. Right, so maybe you're doing something like this currently, or maybe you've seen code like this before. This is where Flysystem tries to come in and address these. You kind of start noticing patterns. We're passing in like just the location here. We know that it's returning a string contents. We notice that each one can have its own error handling. So we start seeing the similarities in the file management. Flysystem is very configurable for local or external services. And so that's something to keep in mind as we're working through it. We'll go into some more details about some of the configuration, but keeping in mind that it's very flexible with where it's writing, and you can change that over time. So the official adapters that are officially supported, you've got local, so think of, again, if you're on the actual web server, it's going to be able to write out to the various directories that are actually on that server, or maybe it has a mounted drive or whatever. You're going to be able to interact with the file system on that local server. You also have in-memory, so temporary files that are not going to be written to disk. They're just going through memory. It's going to be temporary. External, AWS S3 storage. You've got async AWS S3. You've got Azure Blob storage, Google Cloud storage, SFTP, Web DAV, which is a protocol. So you have a variety of options there. And also GitLab. I didn't know that GitLab actually had file storage, but it does. And it's a community adapter that you can use with Flysystem. There's a handful of decorators that we have. There's a read-only decorator. So once you get your adapter, so let's say you're using the in-memory file system adapter, you can go and say, let's make this read-only so we don't mess ourselves up by changing something we shouldn't be, and make it read-only. And so then you have a read-only adapter, and then when you instantiate the file system, the Flysystem, you are just saying, hey, use this adapter, and it's read-only. And then you're not worried about accidental file updates or deletes or whatever. So then you know it's read-only. It's not going to mess with the files that are being interacted with. It's a good safety net to use, depending on your use case, of course, to make sure that you're using the read-only decorator if it's applicable or makes sense. There's also a path prefixing decorator where you're specifying that you say this adapter, we're just going to use this specific directory and we're not going to traverse outside of it. We're going to stay here, and it's really good to limit the scope so you're not wandering or meandering where you shouldn't be to make sure that the file interactions are in the right place. So if applicable, and oftentimes it is, it makes sense to use this decorator with your file system. All right, so that's kind of the quick introduction to Flysystem. We'll jump into their API. I can't tell you how many times I banged my head against something and trying to figure out, scratching my head. Finally, I go and read the documentation. It's like front and center. This is how you do this, right? This is how you address this problem. I don't always read the manual, but when I do, it's because I've already tried everything else. So I thought that was perfect for this. I would say the documentation is decent. It's not the best documentation I've ever used or read, but it's there and it's decent. And it's enough to get you going and moving along. Big key note on that, big asterisk on there. Make sure you're looking at the correct version of their API. It's easy to get onto the wrong version and be looking at an older format and then realize later when you're trying to figure out why it's not documented is because you're looking at the wrong version. So make sure you look at the correct version of documentation, and that will clear that hurdle. All right, so we'll start with exists. So you have file exist, and it just gets a string location of the file, and it will turn back a Boolean true or false. And this is where the beauty of Flysystem comes in, is that this is a function that's on all adapters. So it doesn't matter whether it's an SFTP file, or a local file, or an Azure, or Google Blob, whatever, you're going to be able to just ask and query, does this file exist? And Flysystem will return back that Boolean based on that location. Not having to go write code for all the different adapters, it's on all of them. Directory exists is another one. So just passing the string to the directory, and we'll find out whether that directory exists and is available or not. There's also the has, which is behind the scenes. It's just a file exists or directory exists. So then you can send in has for files or directories, and it'll tell you true or false if it does have that or not. It has your basic CRUD, so read or create, or write or create, read, move, and delete. So you write, That's kind of expected, kind of looks familiar. There's a string location, where you want to write the file out to. There's the string, the contents, and an array for configuration. We'll go into the configuration areas later. Most of the time, you don't need to worry about that. There are some exceptions, but most of the time, it's not something you have to set. And also write stream. Write stream is super helpful for large files, or if you have issues with connectivity, perhaps. So streaming files is a consideration, depending on, especially with larger files, is what I have found. That's been my experience. Or if it's a service that may go down occasionally, or it's not super reliable. Anyways, writing stream is helpful too. It's the same parameters passed in. Read. Similar to write, we have a read, that's just the location, and a read stream that returns, I missed that string, but you have delete API, which is just to delete the file. Again, if you're like on read only, you're not going to be able to delete the file. And delete directory, used with caution is a good way to put that one. A good word on that one. To be able to delete a whole directory, maybe if you're writing out to a specific directory temporarily and you've processed through all the files, this may clean up the directory after you're done. Those kind of things. With create directory, so being able to create a new directory, which is pretty common when you're working with files. Maybe you have a unique ID or some sort of hash or something that you're writing out to a directory. Let's create a directory and then a list contents, which can be very helpful. No more having to go and grab the metadata for the directory or for each over that. It's got a directory listen, which implements an iterator interface, and so you can for each over it, get an array, whatever. But it takes care of that, and also has a option for deep or shallow. So depending on if you want to iterate down into the subdirectories. Move. These ones, we're going to get into the mount manager later, and these are where the mount manager really shines. So kind of store that thought. But for moving files and copying files, as you'd expect, be able to move a file from one place to another, or copy it, leaving it in place, and putting it in another new location as well. There's also metadata, different API functions you can use. Last modified, get back a timestamp when it's last changed. Super helpful for processing files, or maybe you have some sort of customer that's uploading files to you, right? You want to make sure it's not still changing. File size, MIME type, checksum to ensure that one returns the hash, the MD5 hash of the contents of the file. Permissions, you have the ability to set visibility, and the visibility will return just what the current visibility is. You have URLs, so public URLs for like your S3, if you want to be able to access that for Azure. That applies to S3, Azure, Google Cloud, and Web DAV, and also the temporary URL. I don't use these ones very often. I'm not super familiar with them, but they're there. Frameworks. This is where we start thinking about implementation. It is bundled already with Laravel. It's available with Symfony, so it can be added on, plugged in, whatever. And it can be used with other frameworks. I've used it with Laminus as well before, or Zen Framework. So if it's not bundled in, it's most likely available to be used with your framework. Some implementation strategies. And we told them implementation would be easy. That's the story of my life with development. It always takes longer than I think it will. It's always harder than I want it to be. But we as humans are really bad at estimating and figuring things out, but yeah. So we'll go over Flysystem configuration settings, exception handling, wrappers, and mount manager, as I've alluded to already. Flysystem is very configuration driven. And so you can inject different configuration for each of the adapters. So local is a fairly easy one. It's just the directory. AWS, you might have your key and your secret, maybe which region you're in, which version you're using, the bucket you're on, and so on. Each of these have a different configuration. That's honestly the hardest part. Their documentation does go through and list out the different configuration array key points, the keys and values to use, and a little description of what it is. And so each one you have to go and figure out, look it up, and use it and plug it in to your adapter. They're usually not too hard, but you just have to know those, what those configurations are. The big bonus of the configuration is that the application becomes more flexible. And you can have, for example, your configuration might be coming from the database, or it might be from your configuration files, whether those are PHP or other. So for example, maybe you have a UI where customers go and configure their file systems. Maybe they have a whole bunch of different accounts with different adapters, and so they can go and configure those, set them up, which brings in the scalability. So now instead of having to go and write one at a time, you're being able to store something in the database or some sort of file and have the scale out to meet your demands from your customers, whatever your project's working on. Exception handling. There are a lot of exceptions that can be thrown through Flysystem. Something to be aware of and be prepared for. But it turns out to be super helpful in troubleshooting very distinct issues that are happening. Because as I talked about earlier, file system management, it can be very tricky, it can be very difficult. There's all sorts of nuances that can pop up. And so they have really good exceptions to be able to handle what needs to be handled. There is a generic one, file system exception, but there's also very specifics like unable to read file, and unable to delete file, unable to check file existence. This is just very scratching the surface, but know that there are many, many exceptions to handle. And there's the link if you want to go look at them. As a general strategy with Flysystem and exception handling as a whole, you want to catch the specific exceptions and handle them in your code. Maybe it's some sort of log or some sort of alert. If a file failed to upload or to be sent off or be written, you might want to know about that. And so however you're logging, however you're trying to alert on those, or whoever needs to be alerted for those. And then throwing some sort of meaningful exception that can be usable. So if a customer is trying to, or a user for your application is trying to upload a file, they don't want to see, we shouldn't be showing them what's going on behind the scenes with where the files be written. But if user-friendly sort of exception message of why, try again later kind of thing, if we found out that the service is down. Or maybe contact an administrator so that we can get alerted and know what's going on, even though we've already been alerted potentially. For example, if we're trying to read a file, we had the location coming in, a try on getting the contents, so file system read from the location. Again, this is any of the adapters, which is where it's super clean. Catch unable to read, and then catch a file system exception, where the unable to read is a more specific, more granular error, and we can handle that one however we need. And then catching the more generic file system exception, which the other ones extend, and so being able to, if there's something different went on, something kind of wonky, something we're not used to seeing, and then returning the contents back out. Wrappers or facades. There's some debate on the terminology, but I'll just use wrapper and facade interchangeably. Abstracts away, and for me this has been super helpful. It just makes it so the package is, we're agnostic to the package. And so, for example, you might want to have some sort of file system service or some sort of file system class that is not specific to the vendor. In this case, the package would be Flysystem, but then Flysystem is also being able to, has all these different adapters being able to come in. And so we swap out the packages. It also makes unit testing actually possible. Using the, what I'll call the legacy or old way, or the straight raw way of interacting with files is not easily testable, we'll say. It is testable technically, but there's some kind of nuances into doing that. So some, for example, if you think about wrappers, file system, but extends out to maybe an email service. If your system needs to send out emails, you make some sort of generic email class that actually does the sending of emails, and it doesn't care who your provider is. It just knows that it needs to send out an email. Or maybe sending out SMS messages. We have, for example, we have Vonage as one of the sponsors. I downloaded their API and tried and just made like an SMS service and tested it. I was able to send a text message out using their SMS service, where I injected it as a client, an SMS client. So that was super clean. Databases. So you may or may not notice, or might not have thought about it this way, but using the database, you're using essentially an adapter or a wrapper, I should say, around your database layer, where we're not instantiating or using databases all over the place. We usually have some sort of centralized way to interact with the database, some sort of database service or adapter, and we're using that to write out to the different databases. So whether that's Postgres or MySQL or Oracle or SQL Server or Single Store or Mongo or ... down the line. Another good example is a queuing system. If you're using messaging for queuing up new messages, you might have a wrapper around that. So just kind of a more broader concept of using wrappers within code. So you have one place to do these. And so the benefit there is you have a centralized code. You're not having many different files. It makes it so much easier to test. And if you need to replace it sometime in the future, you just go to one place and replace it there. I've had to go and do vendor changes, like for email providers, or with actually faxing back in the day. And it was a nightmare because that was distributed out along the code. And so I took that and made it compartmentalized into one central place with a wrapper. And from then on out, we actually ended up changing the vendor again later, and it made it super smooth and clean. So, for example, we have class file storage service. Just generic, right? It could be used for with anything behind the scenes. In this case, we've chosen to use Flysystem. It says file system because it's namespaced. Public function read, and it's just going to call the file system, which is using Flysystem, and do its reading, right? So here we've created this wrapper for the file service or file system. I keep interchanging those. That's hard. That's tricky. This is where we get into the beauty of the mount manager. So the example here, maybe we need to be able to grab files from one service and write them locally, right? So maybe a customer drops files in an SFTP, and we need to grab those periodically and write them locally so we can ingest them, parse them, process them, whatever we're going to do with those, right? Maybe another scenario is we need to be able to move files between adapters, right? So we don't know which those adapters might be. It might be WebDAV or an SFTP or a S3 or wherever, It needs to be able to bounce around between different places. Or maybe we have many customers, and we create reports locally because we have the database. We store those locally, we create them, and with maybe a messaging queue, and then those reports need to be delivered based on the customer configuration, or project configuration. So we don't know where those are going to go. It's based on some sort of config. And they need to go to a variety of storage locations. So those are kind of some scenarios where the mount manager comes into play. What the mount manager does is it interacts with different file systems at the same time. So you specify an adapter and a location. So for example, if a mount manager has been configured with S3 and local, it can now move files between the two of them. It can now copy between the two of them. It can go back and forth. And so you just specify AWS S3 or local, depending on how that's configured. Going back to the SFTP example, so you could write from S3 to SFTP. So now we're just doing it in one hop, rather than having to go out and do this all over the place. So it's super helpful for condensing down your file management so that it's centralized in one place. There's my amazing image. The arrows are perfectly lined up as normal. Okay, they're not. So you can think of the mount manager as kind of this central thing that's sending out files back and forth, writing it along. It can go both directions. It's kind of a visual representation of what I was trying to explain. All right, so we have our file manager. This is an example of how you might write some code with this. You inject the mount manager. Ian Lippman had a great talk earlier today about dependency injection. This is the constructor injection pattern. But it's written in PHP 7.4 style, not with PHP 8 plus property constructor promotion. Anyways, so it can then read this from the mount manager, right? And so we don't care which adapter it's coming from. It can read it from wherever. Maybe it can move things or wherever. But then you need a file manager factory. So now we start getting to the factory pattern. We're going to go and create, it just creates a bunch of different mounts, we'll say, or configurations, where each mount is a different adapter. And so we're going to add these, just push them on, right? So SFTP, maybe it's Google Cloud, maybe it's Azure, maybe it's whatever. And so we're just going to start pushing these onto the file system, or the adapter, the mount manager. And so now the mount manager can go and now we can access these different protocols, these different locations, these different adapters. And then maybe we have a factory beyond that. So this is kind of a little cascading effect there that happens with the mount manager, so it's a little weird. But when you plug it in this way, then we're able to go and create these different adapters and shove them into this mount manager and go on our merry way and have it all taken care of in one place. So AWS S3 and local, those are as mentioned, the protocols. That's what I was talking about. You reference the file with AWS S3 : / and then the path and local : / Anyway, so that's how you configure where it's going to be going. And we say this is going to this adapter. Testing. This happens all the time, right? Read the docs, make a plan, write the code. Code fails. Okay. I think my code fails more than it succeeds. But getting it there, once it gets there, right, then we're all happy. So as I mentioned earlier, historically, testing file management is difficult. Often we end up with various test files in our code base to do this, or we're injecting, making up file content. Maybe you have in your git ignore file, like ignore these test files directory. We're skipping, we'll just skip it. We'll just kind of turn a blind eye to it, ignore it. And then we have integration tests versus unit tests. So often we'll end up doing integration tests or end-to-end tests rather than unit tests specifically for when you're not using some sort of adapter, because there's not a way to okay, technically you can, but yeah, we're not overriding these built-in PHP functions. We're having to use fopen, for example. So you end up with something like this. You have this test read, which has a file. It says this file is an actual file on the server or on the system, and it's going and reading this file, and then you're asserting that the contents are something that you've pre-typed into this text file that you've created locally. So it is, I consider these integration tests. There's some arguments about the naming, but anyways, integration tests is what that's ultimately doing. The Flysystem abstraction layer gives you the ability to actually test what's going on without having to make up files locally. And so you can start mocking these file interactions. Your code is becoming more single purpose, which is the S in solid. And then you're having a more centralized file system management. So it's really helping push for these best coding practices. So now we end up with something like this. This was written with just the built-in PHP unit format. I also use mockery and prophecy, but I kept this one clean. So you have, for example, a test path. You just make something up. You then mock the file system with the the get mock builder. Just throw on a disable original constructor, saying we're only going to mock or only methods read, and you want to mock that. And you say when the read is called with the path that we just created, this made-up path, that it will return some pre-specified text. And now we can actually go and write a test for that and not have to actually interact with the file system. So now it's actually a unit test rather than an integration test. I consider a unit test something that is as a test that does not reach out externally to the system. So no database interactions, no API calls, no file system reading, like those kind of things. I think both are very beneficial and definitely are useful. But now with Flysystem, we can have both, not just integration tests, but we can have unit and integration tests. Kind of some discussion items. I've given this talk before at Merge PHP, and I've talked with some coworkers and others about Flysystem. So there's kind of these questions of benefits of Flysystem. It provides that quick development to be able to scale up different adapters and be able to read out. There's also some, there's a question of cons too. I have heard the argument that then you're locked into using the specific package. I haven't really had that be a problem though. Generally, I like the benefits far outweigh the cons to me, especially with like the exception handling, the error handling, where that can get really tricky and convoluted with file systems. Security and credentials. Security should always be a question when you're going and grabbing third-party packages. Flysystem is in the league of extraordinary packages. So it has very good code with good test coverage, good security protocols. So I haven't had security issues with it. And then there's credential storage. That's a whole nother day, another talk that I'm not an expert on. As far as credential storage and security or vaults and how to do that, but be very mindful of that as you start interacting with adapters of where you're actually putting your credentials, how you're storing them, how you're retrieving them. They shouldn't be just raw in your code, and you shouldn't be committing those in anywhere. Conversion costs, scalability, maintenance. I have used Flysystem for about a dozen years. It's been used it quite a while. I've mentioned I've used it with S3 mostly. I've used it to, it's very heavily used with pretty large files. We're talking thousands and thousands of files every hour going in and out of this. So scalability, I haven't had issues with scalability. It's really been more server capacity is the bigger problem I've run into. You know, if you start running out of space on the files on the server. Maintenance, they don't have a ton of versions released. You know, I'd say it's fairly, you know, they do have updates. They do make updates to Flysystem, but it's not like super rapid fire. You're not, you know, constantly getting burned by backwards compatibility and those kind of issues. It's been really easy for me to upgrade the different versions there. So we've gone over again the external services, which adapters are available. We've gone over the API, so you should be familiar with how to use it, whether that's reading, writing, moving, copying, grabbing metadata, checking the MIME type, doing a checksum, whatever. Some strategies like the mount manager, the adapter or facades that you can use for those, and how to actually write tests for these. So hopefully it gives a good idea, a good introduction of how to actually use Flysystem, or maybe if you're already using it, you get some new ideas or new pieces of Flysystem that you can go and implement. Go, you know, as you head out of here, you can go create a user story, or however you're open a ticket, whatever your term you're using, to go and actually start doing these things. That for me has been the best value from going to conferences, is actually making these changes. I co-organized the Utah PHP user group. I love doing outdoors things. I'm always out and about. I write security certification exam questions and work on a vulnerability management project, or basically security scans. So basically we grab all this data, process it, analyze it, make trends on it, and so on. You can find me on Mastodon, Twitter, everything else on MB Niebergall. Yes, I've done a triathlon. That was so much fun. I've run marathons, those kind of fun things. And as I mentioned, I live in the mountains, and we have epic amounts of snow this winter. We've had a lot of fun skiing. I go fast and crazy down the hills. Yes, that's me in the orange coat. Get myself in trouble, going up jumps, whatever. And I co-designed the Zend elephant. That was back in the day. That's my personal favorite elephant. That will open up to questions.
Anyone? See any hands? You're obviously very thorough there.
Covered every question possible.
Oh no, we have one. We have one.
Hi, Mark. How do we handle the files? You know, some customers shouldn't access that file, so for other customers' URLs. Is that something that Flysystem covers, or is it something that we should handle in the application, or is there any workaround in the Flysystem?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, how should we limit customers' permissions to different files?
Yeah.
Yeah. Flysystem, I wouldn't say takes care of that. It doesn't handle who should see what. You can set the visibility, set the permissions, you know, so you're, you know, if you're going to 777 the file, it's going to be accessible to everybody kind of thing. You can lock it down, though, with the visibility and the chmod on it, but it doesn't, yeah, you have to, that's the extent of its ability, or what it can do, though, is just setting the permissions on there. Like with some of the adapters I've done, like I mentioned with S3, we've set up like roles and those kind of things where you use the adapter's permission system, essentially. You know, so if you're writing off to Google or Azure or wherever, making sure that you're in the right bucket or equivalent of those to make sure that we isolate off the customer information.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Any further questions? Okay, no, that's all. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.